What I'm going to share with you today, and I know we have limited time, so a lot to cover, is my work with DORA, Declaration for Research Assessment, and specifically around some of the tools that I've been helping them to develop over the past few years. So what I'm going to do is sort of give a big picture overview and then a deep dive into two tools, and give a little bit of a sense of both why we created them and also what we're hoping to do, and have them be useful for the broader population. So the field of research assessment, may not seem like a design-oriented field. I'm a designer. That is my full-time role. I'm an associate professor at the Institute of Design here in Chicago. But my work with DORA has really revolved around the recognition that research assessment reform is both a design issue, a behavioral issue, and a systems issue. And you'll see that some of the tools really reflect on the fact that this is a complex system that we're designing into. One of the reasons why I'm part of this team and part of this work is because my background is in both design and behavioral science. And behavioral science can give us a lot of really valuable insights into why people do things or don't do things that may or may not be about their best interest. So for example, sort of the rational behavior of pursuing citations, even if we recognize that that may not be the only thing that's important to us. But the fact that there is a very strong infrastructural set of issues that we need to consider, this is not just about individual choice. That's actually a really essential thing to that we probably all know, but the nature of how systems work impacts what we do. And one instance of that, for example, is that the broader way in which things are measured has an enormous impact on what we may decide to do and how we may focus on certain types of behaviors or not. Please don't expect to read all of this. I'm just sharing this as a little bit of an example and kind of a background. This is some work that I did several years ago, but it really is, at the very least, at a high level, teasing out some of the issues that we need to address and why it is both behavioral and systemic and a design issue. So those of you who are familiar with DORA, for example, recognize that things like citations and journal impact factor really run the show often in terms of how people prioritize what they do, but those aren't just accidental. They're actually held in place by a variety of different players. So this is just a way to illustrate that this isn't, again, just about researcher choice, but what institutions prize and measure, how funders see the value of potentially investing, certainly how journals measure what is useful or not, or what can be promoted. One of the things that makes it a difficult challenge to solve and to intervene in is that it's a very stable system in a way, but it's just not a very healthy one. And so several of the tools that we have tried to develop don't try to solve everything at once, but they do take a dive into what are some of the things that we can do at a little bit more of a strategic level. So the two tools that I am going to introduce and talk a little bit about today work both sort of at more of an infrastructural level, but also have a lot to do with individual behavior as well. And when I say infrastructural, that's partly based on what I was already introducing, that we recognize that institutions, for example, have a very strong role to play. If we only rely on individuals to do the work, we can make progress in very isolated ways, but it really takes the heft of institutions and systems to do this. So the two tools I'm going to describe, one is what we call the SPACE tool or rubric, which is about how institutions can start to chip away at this broader idea of research assessment reform, which is kind of overwhelming if you just tackle it all at once. The other is about how we might reconsider impact, which again is a sort of system-wide issue that many people recognize isn't quite right now, but how we might address it. But before I dive into the specifics, just to give a little bit of a sense of how we do this work. So any of the tools that I have worked on with DORA over these years is not just a top-down perspective. Certainly folks within DORA and myself, we all have ideas about what may matter, but this is very intentionally designed as a participatory process. And so you can see here, this loop means that it's not just participatory, but also iterative. So we often start with what we glean from the DORA community in terms of what's important and what's needed. We develop drafts and, of course, go through iterative processes to develop those, both with formal and informal and internal and external peer feedback. When we share those with the larger community, then those sort of kick off a new cycle of how to improve them and how to continue them. But we're also inspired by things outside of research assessment reform. There are lots of interesting examples out in this world, and so being able to take stock of those and see how they might help us think through the system is also an important aspect of this. So when looking at this tool, this really was designed to help institutions think about how to start, again, chipping away or evolving their perspectives towards research assessment reform. And there were several very significant challenges that fed into this. One is that every institution is distinct and different, and there's really not a perfect way of doing things. Contexts are different. There are also, I've mentioned, sort of alluded to this already, this isn't just about individual leadership, but also recognizing how institutions have to redesign themselves sometimes in order to achieve this. The two biggest issues, though, that we heard from individuals is that it's very difficult to know where to start. And that is often because it's very difficult to envision something different without seeing examples of it. So in this case, we started with those insights about what might need to change. And our goals revolved around helping institutions not just evolve point solutions, but sort of evolve themselves to better support research assessment reform. And this relied on thinking systematically and taking what feels like an enormous task. It's like going from sitting on your couch to running a marathon. The way to do that is to sort of think through steps. How can I get from one place to another? And then this required both thinking concretely to provide examples, but also recognizing the flexibility was important. So with all of this in mind, we went through this iterative cycle several times based on community calls and feedback. And what we evolved in this case was a rubric, essentially, that is not a one-size-fits-all, but recognizing that these 5 criteria that you see on the left enable at least a smarter way of diving in. So, for example, just the idea of setting standards is incredibly valuable because we all may be having conversations where we don't realize we're applying different definitions to the same word. Processes and policies are essential in order to systematically replicate certain types of solutions. A sense of accountability also matters quite a bit. If everyone thinks it's somebody else's responsibility, it's hard to get things done. And responsibility at high levels of leadership, for example, could set the tone that this was important. We recognize that culture cannot be designed, but you have to recognize the culture you're designing into. So that's an important aspect for achieving change. And then finally, again, this theme of iterative feedback and evaluating success. And then across the top, you can see that this was intentionally designed for flexibility. So each institution may have a very different starting place. In some cases, it may be taking the first step. In other cases, it may be scaling up a very robust set of issues already. So this rubric, the intention here, and I promise I will not read this screen, but just to give a little bit of a sense of, again, this balance of flexibility and concreteness that was very important to us. If you take a zoom in, the rubric itself is not intended to be prescriptive. It was very important that this be something that we can use to sort of bring concreteness through examples and to help people recognize what good might look like, but not to describe sort of an absolute or a perfect way of doing things. So in this case, the hope is that this is not a way to say there's the only version of what good looks like, but at least to help people start to make connections that they may not otherwise. And I should also add that these materials in this case also evolved into things like workshop materials. So the idea that this is just something that hangs on a wall or on a hard drive was also augmented and supplemented with tools that people could actually take into practice, hold meetings with. We heard, for example, that it was very, very useful to have these conversations with a whole variety of different people in the room. So this wasn't just a leadership exercise, but it was a really way to integrate different folks into the conversation. The other aspect of a tool like this that we felt was important was the more that we could express how, not just the definitions for how to do things, but the sense of change over time. It can be very difficult when achieving systems change to recognize how to kind of start with a starting place and feel like you're making progress there, but also to balance that with where do we go next? Or where should we start to look and how do we start to see a path forward? Sometimes taking the first step is genuinely the hardest thing, but maintaining that path forward also requires a good deal of sort of insight and effort and recognizing what's coming next. So one of the reasons that we designed this rubric in this case the way that we did was that we had heard from our community and the audience that being able to see kind of where, not what bucket they fit into necessarily, but being able to see how they might be able to coordinate efforts internally, but also recognize how they might benchmark in accordance with other types of universities and institutions. So you can see on the left, this idea of with a downward arrow, there's some places where going deep may be very important in order to make sure that you're covering all these foundational aspects, but also recognizing where in some cases you may be ahead of the game. So the idea was not to say that you need to move from left to right, but essentially that the combinations of these things, again, could be flexibly applied to an individual organization. And you can see on the right side, in this case, a very small text, so I don't expect people to read that, but this notion of almost playing chords, where you might see yourself, for example, in an early stage, just even figuring out what to do, how to get people aligned. That may require a good amount of effort in a small set of areas. As one moves further and as an institution starts to develop these capabilities, it might then allow them to start focusing on other areas. So again, thinking of almost this game board of different places that we might apply. And then on the right, this broader sense of how we might think about bringing together different types of capabilities, how you might grow from one into the next. So in this case, this space tool is actually in use in a variety of different settings internationally. We've held several workshops with a variety of international groups. So it's exciting to see that at least this is starting to take some ground. Again, not to solve problems necessarily, but at least to start to give people a roadmap for what that might begin to look like. The second tool that I wanted to introduce, a slightly different kind of level of problem solving, but with some of those same principles in mind, if you will. So the second tool that I'm going to describe was about scholarly impact, which is it feels like it should be easy to solve. Let's just recognize different kinds of impact. But again, there's so many different ways in which the system itself is almost structured to keep looking and recognizing certain kinds of impact over others. So here we recognize that there are very strong legacy indicators, which are very difficult to dismiss, and they're still very highly embedded, even though there is, again, broad recognition that they may not be the only ones, or that they can actually be narrow and occasionally misleading. This is something DORA has believed in for quite some time. There's also the challenge, of course, that sometimes things which are less quantitative can be harder to measure and therefore harder to reflect. So where things like citations, nicely quantifiable, there are other types of work which are emergent, whether it's interdisciplinary, things like mentoring, a lot harder to represent what good can look like there. So this reflected a need to sort of move on and start to understand not just what was possible, but how to recognize and reflect it. But again, as with the space tool, we recognize that without seeing an alternative model, it's very difficult to just decide that there's going to be a change. So with those challenges in mind, the goals that we wanted to address, one was being able to present a different mental model, a different structure and way of thinking of how we might consider what impact looks like. You'll notice again here that this idea of concreteness and flexibility is a continuing principle that we think was very important, with the recognition that institutions are all quite different and disciplines are quite different. That was quite important. And then also the recognition that this is never about just getting rid of a system. Change is incremental, and it makes sense that we need to recognize what is still considered valuable. And in fact, one of the challenges with changing things like impact is that institutions might worry that changing their system then puts their people at a disadvantage if they move elsewhere, because the things that may make sense in one context may not in another. So these were all things that were important as we were considering the work. So in this case, probably very familiar, things like journal articles, conferences are a very recognizable, easy to understand way of demonstrating impact that's both direct and also in a disciplinary setting. But what we wanted to expand on with this tool was exploring, well, are there other dimensions that we might consider and different ways that we could think about impact that expanded beyond sort of the norms of journal impact, citations, et cetera. So in order to do that, again, we took the route of asking more broadly in the better community, understanding what were things that they felt were important, and that were genuine challenges. This was not just a theoretical exercise. So one of the things, or one of the sets of things that we heard, was that the way in which influence itself can be demonstrated is too narrow when we only think about kind of traditional means of publication. So direct contributions are still enormously important, for example, but there's increasing recognition that things like team leadership and team research, for example, is more and more the norm. There are also ways in which cultivating, the younger generation and the ways in which they will move on, things like mentoring, teaching, are also almost like a secondary value. If you can train up your students quite well, your postdocs, that creates a whole new set of influence that you might not otherwise have. And then, of course, there are ways in which magnitude can be scaled, whether it's in terms of greater stature or platform level representation. So there may be things like advising in policy, which are at a much, much greater scale than one could have within a smaller institution. So if that was our first dimension, the other way that we thought and that we heard was important is that oftentimes traditional scholarly work is done within a discipline, it's for a field, and you can make a great deal of impact, of course, that's not going away, speaking to people who are part of your community. But also that increasingly we can recognize how there are broader settings for sharing that research that can be quite powerful and quite impactful. So one, if we move a step out, is looking at broader institutional settings or academic settings, which extend beyond an individual discipline, but can start to get traction and inform collaborative thinking and interdisciplinary thinking. And then, of course, there are contexts external to academia altogether, which are often not recognized quite with the same value, but being able to establish, for example, a profile on social media can allow us to reach new audiences that can actually enable great research to reach new ears that it wouldn't otherwise. So building on these two dimensions, we came up with, and we tested this with several experts and people who were interested in this space so that we could get their feedback as well, this broader set of potential forms of impact. So you'll note that the notion of traditional journal articles and conference publications, for example, has not gone away, but recognizing that collaborations with industry can be a very powerful way of recognizing how impact goes out into the broader world. It may not necessarily be in the same way as a journal article, but it can be a way that we can get ideas out and have an enormous amount of economic, social, environmental impact. Again, recognizing that in the case of policy, for example, also there are different ways that somebody's not just skills, but knowledge base could reach a whole new set of individuals that could have enormous impact because of the scale with which they're reaching it. So just again, this was not proposed as something to dismiss or to take away from traditional forms of impact, but simply to be more expansive and also to recognize that real sort of concreteness can be helpful in terms of seeing what could look like and different ways to think about how we might see that. The other aspect, though, that was sort of interesting and I like about this framework quite a bit is that it also allowed people to see in themselves what might be good ways of sort of marking success. When impact is very much about sort of matching a prior mental model of what good looks like, it can hem us into a very specific way of thinking. In the design field where I come from, there's this notion of a T-shaped person or a T-shaped individual, which is somebody who has broad knowledge, but also a depth. So if you think of the broad and the depth as a T, that kind of inspired some of the ideas here, where somebody being able to see who they could be or what could they evolve into, could help them form their own sense of what they wanted to pursue. I mean, this could be especially relevant and useful for early career researchers, for example, who may not quite know what kind of researcher they wanted to turn into. So just a couple of illustrative examples here. There is nothing wrong with being a very traditional disciplinary specialist. So there may be people who start off and build their profile, establish more and more reputation, and then eventually grow a bigger platform simply by being excellent and excelling in their particular research area. That is not going away, and that's incredibly important. But again, it's not the only model in this case. There may be other people for whom the application of research can really end up driving where they want to be. Now, this may be difficult for an early career researcher, for example, because you still may need to develop an initial reputation, but the notion that there is incredible value in all sorts of disciplines for achieving and attaining kind of real world impact can help somebody potentially see where it is that they want to be focusing, and recognizing that there are things that they can expand upon. And again, if that's a goal, that can be a way that early career researchers might plan and structure how they progress in order to do something a bit different. In yet another vein, increasingly team science, team research, interdisciplinarity is recognized as an important aspect of what impact can be, but it also tends to be a little bit harder sometimes to find venues for that. So even publishing work that is cross-disciplinary in a publication can be difficult, which tends to be quite specialized. But again, if somebody sees this notion of being cross-disciplinary as something that's valuable and important and motivating, this may allow them to start to construct a way of sort of building on their expertise and looking for opportunities that allow them to evolve into an increasingly interdisciplinary specialist. And then finally, there are ways in which sort of cultivating inter-institutional skills can also be valuable. So in the case, not just of things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but things like that can allow us to recognize how this isn't just about cultivating an individual career. That's always going to be naturally important, but being able to establish interinstitutional or cross-institutional capabilities also quite useful. So I just explained the space framework previously, but in some ways that's actually an excellent example of how taking a role in which you are cultivating a stronger role for research assessment reform could actually make sense in a construct where you're focusing more on that institutional growth. So again, these are only meant to be illustrative, but this notion of not only seeing a new set of possibilities for impact, but also being able to see yourself in it was one of the values that we thought would be useful and important in this. And people have been actually quite responsive in particular to this sense of being able to sort of see themselves in what that could look like. As with any tool, of course, there are different uses and limitations. So just to sort of end on that, this is not the answer. It is an evolving way of approaching things. So as we continue to build more tools, which is still occurring, we're trying to learn from what has worked and what we can improve on in previous ones. So again, in terms of the way that we've been thinking about the value of some of these tools, in particular, the impact one, for example, augmenting different criteria, allowing people to create a new mental model and a new set of language or standards can be helpful in order to build off of that. This notion of both concreteness and legitimacy has been important. We've seen that throughout in any of the tools that we build, actually, partly, again, because being able to illustrate something real is useful, but also being able to see that others have achieved something can also help build confidence that we can do it too. I've described sort of in great detail this sense of sort of different institutional values and being able to set a pathway for career progression. We do recognize, again, though, that a tool is not a one-size-fits-all. So in order to adopt any tool, there has to be this institutional recognition that it's useful and an appetite in order to change it. In this case in particular, one of the things that we've heard, which we're thinking about how to address, is that the sense of evolving over time is actually a very important aspect of impact as well. How does one build a career, or recognizing that careers are built differently? And also completely the recognition that systems are uneven. And so it's one thing to say, here's different impact, but it isn't necessarily, and it wasn't intended to address that there is an uneven playing field underlying it. And then finally, it's always interesting to look for what isn't there. So sometimes there can be negative impact or the absence of it. And so, there are different ways, of course, that we could expand on this work. But I'm actually right on time, which is great. Just to sort of end here with a little bit of a review of the model itself. There are many, many more instances of these tools and the ones that I just described on the DORA site. So that is also, if these are interesting or useful, there is a lot more where that came from. And with that, I think we would be happy if there are questions or comments or things that would be useful to understand, happy to address those as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth, for that tour de force through those tools. I know with the tight timeline, I think that was a lot of really great information. So we can hear online folks in the room, or if there's any questions in the room, we have the mics as well. I'm really looking forward to, we're hosting Ruth next week as well for an hour-long webinar on some of these tools. So I'm really, really excited about that. Any questions from anyone on these? Has anyone used these tools before or seen them before? Some have seen, I'm seeing some nodding, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, we've had some discussions. We had a research impact assessment working group as part of our DORA initiative at the University of Calgary. And it was interesting because that working group was made up of folks from all different disciplines, and I'm always curious to see how folks from different spaces react to kind of language use. And we had a lot of conversations about language. And I wondered if you had heard previously or have any comments on, for the building blocks of impact, some folks felt that it was still heavily STEM focused. And I'm wondering if you've heard that before.
That is, have heard that, and yes, in some ways it is both something that should be addressed, but also in some ways not a surprise, given that many of the folks who were sort of in conversation to help create the tool in the first place were coming from more of the STEM fields. But it's an excellent point, though, and I think the goal would be to ensure that whether it's an evolution of this version or whether there's a next one, to recognize that yes, there should be intentionally as much flexibility and as much use from across disciplines. I would say in this case, yeah, it was largely due to the people who are giving the input into it. But yes, I have heard that. And it's something that we recognize and want to make sure that we kind of dial up in other ways as we revise it.
There's a question in the room as well. Thank you for that. Heather, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, Ruth. I would love to come and hang out with you for a while. I have a question about tools to measure impact for humanities. We seem to have indices, and this follows on with what you've just been saying. We have a lot of indices that we can use for STEM fields in particular, internationally as well as, but finding ways to measure the impact of the humanities scholars is difficult, unless you know of some.
No, in some ways that piggybacks exactly on the question that Stephanie was just asking. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for that. I would actually love to talk to you more if there are things that you're interested in or that you've seen as like the particular challenges there. Because it's partly a matter of the kind of quantitative qualitative issue, I think, is part of what makes that challenging, that you're always going to have at least a little bit more separately from citations, but often it's a little bit easier, for example, to point to like an evidence base of things and be able to use that as a sense of like what is valuable or what impact looks like. One mental model switch that I've actually been really excited about, and it doesn't address your question, but it may point a little bit of a way towards it also, is that we often talk about evidence-based practice, but there are ways in which that is not the only form of value. So thinking about sort of evidence as something which is valuable and can be taken out into the world, I think it would be really fascinating actually to think more about, well, what does that look like in non-STEM or sort of more humanities-based fields? What is evidence of value? We tend to think about those types of things in a fairly narrow way. And so I think that's absolutely worth a more time I know than we have right now, but a more expanded conversation, because it's an age-old challenge, I think, being able to sort of show not just what good looks like, but why it's important. We see that, frankly, in some of the things that I know we're seeing in the States in terms of prioritizing certain types of fields over others. So yeah, it's worth a longer conversation, is what I would say there.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And we'll start to wrap up this session now. I wish we had more time to have a deep discussion with you. So just because we don't have time to do introductions, you're speaking to members of research impact and knowledge mobilization offices from across Canada, both in universities as well as some foundations and funders. So a really key audience for this type of work. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Absolutely. No, it was genuinely my pleasure. And I was very glad to be able to participate with you. So thank you very much for hosting me.